year is 2020, and the World of Warcraft has hit an all-time low in morale. Not only was it coming off of the back of what is today widely regarded as one of the worst expansions, if not the worst, but controversies seem to be an almost monthly ordeal for Blizzard at this point. It was clear the once beloved Blizzard of the past was no more, a reality that was further emphasized by the departure of well-known founding members. One by one, they seemed to be abandoning ship of what was once considered the greatest video game developer of all time. They would start their own personal projects, and as evidenced with the recent release of World of Warcraft Classic, there's a definite yearning for the good old days at this point, as the current version of the game had entered this new dark age, one that was shrouded in the shadow of their next expansion, the Shadowlands. But despite the low morale and the gloom and doom, there did lay a glimmer of hope. Up until this point, when Blizzard did falter, it was quickly followed up by a redemption. Cataclysm was the first sign of trouble, but for Mists, as controversial as it was during its release, many today look back to quite fondly. This was of course followed by the ill-fated Warlords of Draenor, now considered to be a dud, but was quite quickly redeemed by its now favored follow-up, Legion. So, with the battle for Azeroth failing to meet the expectations of the player base, many fell back to this pattern, and they thought that Shadowlands would be the one to bring it back to its former glory. So what was the Shadowlands expansion, and why do many consider it today to be one of the worst moments in the game's history? But first, a word from our sponsor, Helix Sleep. So ever since they started selling the level boost, I told you so by the way, I've found it quite difficult to sleep. I mean, come on, have you heard my voice? Recently I've had the opportunity to try a Helix Sleep mattress, and it's been a life changer for me. This is by far the most comfortable mattress I've ever slept on, and I'm quite happy to be doing this sponsor. In particular, I used to struggle with snoring and just getting too hot while I sleep, and I immediately saw an improvement with both. I took their sleep quiz, which set me up with the perfect mattress. I'm a side sleeper and I love soft beds, so I was matched with the Sunset Luxe, and I also got the Glacio Tex cooling cover, which is designed to keep you from overheating. And I've had the most restful nights I've ever had. I feel way more productive, I have way more energy, and I actually sleep fewer hours now because the hours that I do actually sleep are quality, which leaves more time in the day for me to complain about World of Warcraft. The delivery was seamless and easy. It comes rolled up in a box for easy setup, and they also offer free shipping across the US. So thank you to Helix Sleep for sponsoring this video. I highly recommend you check them out. At least start with a quiz to see if they have anything that might be a good fit for you. Right now you can use my link down below in the comments and description and take advantage of their extended Labor Day sale, which is currently offering 27% off site-wide. The announcement, as expected, was made at BlizzCon 2019, and at this point, many of the players weren't looking forward to a new expansion as much as they were looking forward to getting out of the previous. After 2 years of the most intense lineup of daily and weekly FOMO-infused busy work the game had ever seen, the fatigue was real, and players never wanted to hear the word Azerite ever again. And it was at this convention is where players learned of the Shadowlands, coming off of the battle for Azeroth and its renewed focus on the Alliance versus Horde war, and a 20-second cutscene of an old gun being defeated. The world was left battered and broken. Sylvanas Windrunner, the Horde's war chief, drove much of the conflict, and by its end, she faced off against both factions, but instead of falling, she pulled a shocking move. She shattered the Lich King's Helm of Domination, which teared open this veil between Azeroth and the Shadowlands, which was the Realm of Death itself. This was the act that bridged the two expansions together, and it revealed Sylvanas' betrayal and her alliance with the Jailer, who was this mysterious figure that was revealed to having manipulated the events leading up to this moment. The environment was essentially the afterlife, with each territory governed by covenants with their own agendas, and Players found themselves whisked away from faction battles to this more metaphysical crisis where souls were at stake, and the Jailer's plan to reshape reality looming in the shadows. It set the stage for a story about tangling with death itself and interacting with fallen heroes and villains, exploring new zones, and uncovering Sylvanas' true motives. But Covenants simply weren't a part of the expansion story. They also served as a major feature, with 4 different main factions: the Kyrian of Bastion, the Necrolords of Maldraxxus, the Night Fae of Ardenweald, and the Ventir of Revendreth. After completing the questing campaign, players could choose just one of these covenants to align to, which gave them access to unique abilities, cosmetic rewards, and a narrative campaign that wove them into the story of the expansion. Each covenant offered 2 signature abilities, one that was class-specific and one shared between everyone, which advertised major variety in your gameplay. Additionally, there would be soulbinds, which were customizable talent trees tied to covenant NPCs, the goal to provide deep customization while at the same time connecting smoothly to the story as players worked to restore their covenant's purpose. Some players had immediate concerns, as the choice is a double-edged blade, where by picking one meant excluding the rest, which left questions if players would have to choose between abilities and perks that are more suited for one area of the game, such as raiding, and were lacking in others, such as Mythic Plus or PvP. But for now, only time would tell exactly how this would be addressed. Perhaps the next most flashy feature was Torghast, the Tower of the Damned, inspired by the growing popularity of the roguelike genre, which leans on replayability for its longevity. Torghast was this ever-changing, procedurally generated tower where players ventured solo or in groups up to 5 to battle through floors and enemies, traps, and of course bosses. This tied directly to Shadowlands' narrative, as players braved the tower to rescue souls and craft legendary gear using a currency called Soul Ash, which was earned after successful runs, and was another thing that was time-gated. Each run offered randomized layouts, enemy types, and what they called anima powers, which were these temporary buffs that could supercharge abilities, such as turning the mage's fireball into this room-clearing nuke, or a warrior's charge into this multi-target whirlwind. If you ever played the game Hades, it's a very similar concept, and these powers were aimed to encourage experimentation to offer its variety. Speaking of which though, legendaries were back from the Legion expansion, in some cases literally holding the exact same powers. But between the new talents and the new Covenant abilities, it was clear that choice was a large focus of Blizzard for this expansion, and legendaries would add yet another layer. But unlike Legion's legendaries, however, which you may recall the main criticism for them was their random nature, Shadowlands were targetable and craftable by taking expensive gear made through trade skills to the Rune Carver, who is this jailed entity within Torghast. If you gave him this gear and Soul Ash, you could bind legendary affixes to them in order to customize your toolkit. The tower itself would be accessed through a new high-level zone for the expansion, the Maw, which was the Jailer's nightmarish prison realm in the heart of the Shadowlands. It was this wasteland of lava rivers and towering spires, and it served as the expansion's narrative hub. It's where the most heinous and evil souls went in the afterlife. The gameplay inside of the zone was deliberately harsh, primarily through the Eye of the Jailer mechanic, which was the special meter that increased with actions such as killing enemies or rare mobs, or simply spending time there. As the meter increased, the Jailer would become more and more annoyed by your presence and placed obstacles and enemies in your way until eventually he just spawned these deadly assassins, which essentially barred further progress until a daily reset. The zone itself was much like previous high-level zones released in other expansions, and it held a variety of rare mobs and treasure chests to hunt, and for participating you would get a currency called Stygia, which would be used to purchase gear and cosmetics and other useful perks, and quite harshly it would also be dropped on death, sort of like the Souls series. Although not as flashy, the leveling squish in Revamp was an enormous change in the game's history. With the game relying primarily on vertical progression, a downside was that there's this constant creep in power, and over time it can get out of hand where players are dealing millions of damage. While they'd scaled back these numbers in the past, what was a first for Shadowlands was the level squish, where the developers took the maximum from the Battle for Azeroth, which was 120, and they dropped that to 50, with level 60 to serve as the new maximum by the end of Shadowlands campaign. And it wasn't just for numbers. The entire leveling experience at this point had long been neglected. Surely nothing to do with the fact that you can now pay money to skip it. And they thought it was time for an update. They introduced a new system called Chromie Time, and also a new starter zone, the Exile's Reach. Instead of going through each expansion's story, which at this point had totaled 8, including the Cataclysm's Old World, new players could now start in the Exile's Reach, which was this modern 1 to 10 experience teaching core mechanics through this shipwrecked adventure, although the old original starting zones were still left as an option. From there, players could choose any expansion campaign via Chromie Time, which was this time travel mechanic that let them level from 10 to 50 in, say, Wrath's Northrend or Miss Pandaria, and scaling all the content to their level. So, again, another big form of choice and agency that has been a running theme of the expansion so far. And lastly, another system saw a major update, and that's Mythic Plus. Ever since its introduction in Legion, it had become a staple in endgame progression, but Blizzard thought that its reward structure could use a little work. Up until this point, players were rewarded with loot both at the end of the run and also from this weekly cache that scaled to the highest level keystone that they had completed for that week. They thought that this was a little too random and frustrating, so the Shadowlands saw the release of the Great Vault, where instead of a single random item, players would be offered a choice based on the difficulty of the Mythic Plus runs completed. So again, giving players agency and control over their characters and their progression. And of course, beyond all of that, there were the usual fixings that every expansion had, such as new dungeons and raids. But really, it didn't matter that much. The players were so fatigued by the legendary amount of FOMO from BFA that they were desperate to see anything other than Azerite. It could have been a sprinkle-covered turd, and it would have seemed like an oasis. But still, the question remained, would it follow the pattern and redeem the franchise? Or was it simply a sprinkle-covered turd? As is custom, Blizzard had no issue selling the expansion, as it once again broke records, selling a total of 3.7 million copies within the first 24 hours of release, though some would attribute this to the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic. The expansion released on November 23rd, 2020, during the midst of the panic and lockdowns, where people were hoarding toilet paper and were falling back to the old reliable. Lock yourself inside of your house and play World of Warcraft all day. Combining this with the recent release of Classic, it was truly one of the more nostalgic times during the franchise's history. But what was also nostalgic and actually gave people hope was something that had been abnormal for Blizzard at this point in time. The expansion was delayed. Initially slated for late October, it was delayed 1 month, as due to the COVID delays, the developers thought that it wasn't up to their quality standards. And the reaction, for the most part, wasn't rage, rather enthusiasm. While that may seem surprising, it does make sense, as at this point, the old quality standards that once made the developer great had seemingly disappeared, with the only other expansion to see a delay being the Burning Crusade, which was pushed from December 2006 to January 2007. Outside of the game, with Warcraft 3 Reforged fresh in people's minds, a re-release that was globally panned and clearly released unfinished in order to retain pre-orders. This came as a sign of relief for the players. Many believed that the previous expansion, BFA, was released prematurely, as most of its selling features received major identity-shifting reworks and patches midway through its life. So, while there certainly were some that were disappointed, as this meant another month trapped in a room with the Azerite-addicted Magni, the majority were excited and hopeful that the developers had regained some sort of respect for themselves and their players by refusing to release an unfinished game. And it was only after it was released in November is when players found out if it was indeed worth the wait. They leveled through the zones, got acquainted with the new covenants, hit the maximum level and allied with one, they invaded the Maw, climbed the Tower of Torghast, and explored the new dungeons during the usual honeymoon period of the new expansion launch, which are most always dominated by excitement and positivity until it eventually wears off and people start to see it through a more clear lens. And as history had showed, what they had to say wasn't exactly glowing and similar to the Battle for Azeroth. The reason for that is that nearly every major advertised feature fell short of players' expectations, starting with possibly the most major, the Covenants. The aesthetics, lore, and how they were integrated into the story were all quite well received, but the main criticism fell to the point that the different abilities they offered varied greatly in power, and players couldn't simply switch between them easily. Their initial worries were realized, and this restrictive design, while it certainly had merit, sparked intense backlash. Players felt locked into their Covenant choice, as each faction's class-specific abilities were optimal for specific content, whether it be raiding, Mythic Plus, or PvP, and switching between them was punishing and slow. It required a time-gated quest to leave and rejoin, with progress like Renown or Soulbind unlocks reset, making them feel trapped, as the forums were quickly filled with posts expressing regret of feeling like their characters were nerfed for simply picking, quote, the wrong Covenant, or that choosing one for lore reasons meant sacrificing substantial character power. There is validity in restrictions, as it creates tough choices that feel meaningful, and had it been a different game, it may have even been received well. The issue is that this rigidity clashed with the player base that they had shaped by the time that Shadowlands was released. Ever since its launch, World of Warcraft was designed to be extremely accessible, whether that be less punishment for dying, refundable talent points, and no permanent unrefundable stat points to be allocated. You had instance raids, PvP that was completely optional, and so much more. And as you would know if you'd watched previous episodes of this series, this never stopped, whether it be XP nerfs, Dungeon Finder, Raid Finder, mob tag sharing, the removal of group quests, talent switchable on the fly anywhere in the world, purchasable level boosts in gold, heirlooms, alt-friendly catch-ups, collection tabs. Over the course of 16 years, the game had constantly catered to those who wanted convenience and accessibility, and at this point, it was a major part of its identity, even more so when they re-released Classic, and those who preferred this comparatively less accessible nature and fewer quality of life features transitioned over. It's the same issue they had when they weren't going to release flying in Draenor. While it certainly had its benefits, such as making the world feel larger, that itself is an entirely valid vision, but the issue was that they were pitching it to an audience that, at that point, didn't feel like it was worth the annoyance. So when you try to release a feature that's defined by meaningful choice by way of putting punishing hurdles in between the player and changing and reducing accessibility, you're pitching it to this very same unreceptive player base, and you're going against the very identity that your entire game is now shaped around. Social media were filled with rants calling it a forced RPG element, with many feeling that Blizzard had painted themselves into a corner with years of bending to demands for this unlimited accessibility, making the Covenant's restrictions feel jarring and alienating players who wanted to swap builds for Mythic Plus or PvP. Additionally, this problem was made worse with the fact that the abilities were simply unbalanced. Some vastly outperformed others in specific content, which just fueled frustrations further, and balancing was difficult because increasing or decreasing the effectiveness of abilities had a chance to create a new meta, which would then make players feel more inclined to switch to adapt in this restrictive system. Many felt that it fell victim to the same problem that they had been facing with the talent tree since the release of the game. There's really no meaningful choice because there will always be a best, and players will always want to play the best, so this choice is really an illusion. Famously, in an interview with the game director, Ian Hazakostas, he had remarked that although Blizzard had heard all of the feedback and could, quote, pull the ripcord if they saw the need to relax the punishments for switching, they were sticking with their original vision, as they had felt that, in the long run, it would create a more meaningful experience for the players. This comment fueled a movement of sorts called Pull the Ripcord, where many of its players very vocally campaigned on social media under the threat of unsubscribing. Eventually, they would be successful in their pleas, as in patch 9.1, they had eased switching penalties, but much like the case with BFA, the early damage had been done. Another criticism tied to Covenants was the Anima grind. This would be a slow burn, starting 2 expansions prior in Legion with artifact power, of this concept of this grindable resource that serves as another form of character progression from the beginning to the end of an expansion. In Legion, partly because it was new at the time and partly because the system associated with it, artifacts, were received quite well, the artifact power grind overall wasn't a major point of headache with the fans, but by the time the Battle for Azeroth rolled around, some fatigue had started to set in, and many were discouraged to learn that Azerite was essentially this reskinned artifact power. This time, instead of artifacts, it empowered the Azerite amulet, which served as the way of leveling up Azerite armor. So, with how poorly this was received throughout BFA, you can only imagine the fatigue that set in when players had learned that it would be reskinned once again as Anima. Thematically, it was the lifeblood of the afterlife, a resource representing the essence of souls, and functionally, it was the same routine. You got it from a variety of activities such as world quests, to name one, and you used it to progress your character. This time, it was the currency to upgrade your covenant and to boost character power. However, with it being the 3rd version, players were just over it at this point. The drops were often small, and Sanctum upgrades required massive amounts, leading to endless farming that felt repetitive and slow, with players similar to the Battle for Azeroth feeling pressured to farm daily. The drop rates were increased in patch 9.1, which partially alleviated the issue, but it remained to be a nagging point for the entirety of the expansion. The Ma saw similar frustrations. One of the main ones being was the fact that you simply couldn't mount in them. No, not flying mounts. You couldn't mount, period. So how do you think the same player base that threatened to quit over no flying mounts in Draenor reacted to this? Oh, they were super happy and they thought it was the best feature of the entire expansion. No, they hated it. And again, from a game development perspective, you can see the idea. Combining this with the Eye of the Jailer mechanic, the whole idea of the zone was to make it oppressive and imposing, something that vanilla World of Warcraft is reminisced fondly about. But again, the people who enjoyed that were already playing Classic, and the people left playing Shadowlands simply did not feel like it was worth the inconvenience. Therefore, to them, it just made the entire zone feel like an arduous chore, which wasn't helped with the fact that you dropped your Stygia when you died. Players vented their frustrations over these restrictions, arguing that the grounded and timed nature of it stifled exploration in a zone meant to be a dynamic endgame hub, and it turned daily visits into a repetitive slog. Community posts frequently called the zone anti-fun, the grind for Stygia felt mandatory, yet unrewarding, and the zone's repetitive events, such as killing rares or freeing souls or click on the shiny object, lacked variety and led to burnout, and on both a micro and a macro level. On the macro, ever since the Mists of Pandaria with the Timeless Isle, Blizzard had sort of fallen into this flowchart of releasing a high-level zone with rares and treasure. After the Timeless Isle, you had Tan and Jungle and Draenor, Argus and Legion, as well as Nazjatar and Mechagon in the Battle for Azeroth. And while these zones were exciting and interesting at first, at this point, along with the Anima, it was just another thing that had overstayed its welcome, and as a result it felt quite uninspired and formulaic. As for the Tower of Torghast, this too was another feature that initially excited players, but as the honeymoon period faded, it would suffer the same problems that any feature with a weekly timer would fall victim to. Eventually, players became fatigued. While it would be untrue to say that Shadowlands had as intense of a churn of daily and weekly timers as BFA, it is true to say that the player base still had some lasting fatigue from the absolute over-the-top insanity from BFA. The core issue was repetition. You had to run Torghast repeatedly to farm enough currency for legendaries, but the randomized floors often felt samey, with similar enemies and traps despite the shifting layouts, as players soon likened to calling it Choreghast. The legendaries were quite powerful, so the grind was mandatory for endgame content, and this discontent was fueled further by unbalanced mechanics, especially at first, as some classes certainly got the short end of the stick with the new anima powers. While some could essentially autopilot, others had to claw and peck their way to the top. So, while some felt that it had potential, for others it was simple. It's simply impossible, no matter how well a feature is designed, for it to remain interesting and fun if it's required every week for the better part of 2 years. So those who watched the episode on BFA may be getting some deja vu at this point. The issue with Shadowlands is that nearly every major feature of the expansion was disappointing. Not everything though. The Great Vault was very well received, and it helped quite a bit with that frustration of completing challenging content only to feel like you're at the complete mercy of RNG. And to that end, it's a system that's still integrated into the game today. A running theme you've noticed with these videos is that, regardless of the expansion, even the not-so-great ones, the criticisms for its rating are quite rare. But unfortunately, this too is where Shadowlands would see some pretty heavy criticism, particularly with the second raid tier, the Sanctum of Domination. Many believed that the raid had an overabundance of mechanics that required players to stop damage, which proved to be mildly frustrating.
Dude. Fucking spit on this horrible game, man. Every boss! Stop damage, guys, stop damage, guys. Guys, too much damage, guys. Stop damage, please, guys, stop damage. Like, dude! I don't want to stop damage! I don't want to stop damage! Horrible game design!
The raid also held the almost unanimously hated Shards of Domination system, released in patch 9.1 and drawing from the lore of the Shattered Helm of Domination. These unique and upgradable gems represented its fragments and were socketed into special domination sockets on raid gear and dropping from bosses. There were 3 types of shards. You had Blood, which was red and focused on health and damage, Frost, which was blue, emphasizing shields and crits, and Unholy, which was green, which was about debuffs and haste, with 9 total variants, each offering passive effects that boosted power in all of Shadowlands content. The issue is that it ended up being a very RNG-based system, taking some players many times the amount of boss kills to get the equivalent of someone else. This was made worse with the fact that the power spikes were quite large, so you had this very impactful system that you had very little control over, similar once again to the Legion legendaries. Another issue is that it forced the recrafting of legendaries if a domination piece overlapped slots, which meant more Tower of Torghast, which people were already unhappy with, especially with other elements of the game being very tedious and grindy. And similar to the issue with the Covenants, the shards themselves were very unbalanced, and it seemed like those who actually enjoyed it were few and far between, as even the most devout fans were starting to become quite frustrated with the number of failed systems that the expansion held. Another issue was the story, often delivered through raiding, and for many, this ended up being the most disappointing thing with the expansion, and there are a few primary reasons for that. The first, and anyone will tell you this, being the main villain, the jailer. Second was Sylvanas fatigue, and third was that its bad story wasn't even contained in its own expansion, as it retconned over 2 decades of lore that players actually enjoyed. As for the actual zones and art design, as usual, they were as stunning as ever. If there's anything that Blizzard is consistently great at, it's the art direction, and the zones were visually a sight to behold in their own unique way. They were immersive, interesting, imposing, and they immediately drew you into this new world, and they made you excited to explore all of the nooks and crannies. But the issue wasn't with the world, it was just with the story, and where to even begin with this? I guess we'll just start with Sylvanas Windrunner, who is the antagonist of the Battle for Azeroth. Some will disagree with the word antagonist there. Blizzard themselves attempted to pitch her as morally gray, but I'm pretty sure you lose that label when you burn down an entire city to the ground. I don't know, maybe that's just me. Is drowning a basket full of kittens morally gray too? But if you saw the BFA video, you would know that she was front and center, the main attraction for the Battle for Azeroth, lying at the heart of the conflict between the Alliance and the Horde, and she would simply do things that didn't really make any sense and conflicted with her character, with hints that there's some grand, ulterior, larger plan that the players would eventually be made aware of. And this continued throughout the entirety of the expansion with no answers. So, by the time that BFA had concluded, there was already this fatigue. She had inexplicably become the most powerful entity in the universe, mowing down everything and everyone in her path, with little to no explanation as to why or how. It felt like the developers had just watched too much Game of Thrones, which wouldn't be a problem if they weren't relying on Season 8 on repeat.
I'm not going to stop the wheel. I'm going to break the wheel.
So, what are we doing?
Breaking the cycle.
But the issue is that this format doesn't translate well into a video game expansion. In a TV show where new episodes are released weekly until a season is concluded, information is delivered in a consistent and orderly fashion with a general beginning and end, with some exceptions of storylines that continue into the next season as a hook. But for an MMO, you get a little bit of story in-game, then 4 months pass, and then you get a little more, and then a book is released that you have to purchase separately, then 4 months pass, and then the next patch continues the story of the book only. Then a developer puts self-inserts of himself while role-playing on Twitter. So the end result is a fanbase that has absolutely zero idea of what is going on, and after being strung along for about 2 years in BFA, they had simply stopped caring. So to begin here, before the expansion even launched, to learn that Sylvanas is yet again another major primary character didn't please people too much, but she wasn't alone. She was of course joined by the Jailer, which is the other half of the issue with the story of Shadowlands, his real name being Zoval. He was introduced as this mastermind behind this cosmic crisis, a shadowy titan-like figure imprisoned in the Maw, who sought to rewrite reality using the Shattered Helm's power. What Blizzard had hoped was that the players would see him as this architect of major Warcraft events, but throughout all of the expansion, his motives were vague and his character was dull and flat. He was a generic evil overlord with little personality, which would be bad enough by itself, but the issue was that all lore previous to his sudden appearance was retconned. It was revealed that he influenced the creation of the Lich King and ordered the creation of the Helm of Domination and Frostmourne, meaning that the Lich King's reign from Ner'zhul to Arthas was orchestrated by the Jailer to funnel souls into the Maw, and it completely reframed the entire Wrath of the Lich King story that many point to as the prime of the game. So, decades of lore, starting in Warcraft 3, was now a mere cog in Zoval's cosmic plan. People were furious, and they called it exactly what it was. A cheap retcon that completely disrespected Arthas' agency and the emotional weight of the entire story of the Frozen Throne and the Wrath of the Lich King. But they didn't stop there. Next was the Burning Legion, which was another major cornerstone of Warcraft lore. Similarly, they were tied to the Jailer, revealing that it was his agents manipulating Sargeras. Yeah, it was Chris Chan levels of fanfiction. And again, the issue is that if the story of Shadowlands was contained in its own terrible expansion, it would be fine, but it wasn't, and it actually retroactively cheapened actual beloved expansions in lore without any sort of build-up. It was like a finger snap out of nowhere. This all-knowing mastermind with vague motives and no personality had been behind some of the most iconic lore and moments within Warcraft's history. There was a slow drip of lore through the following patches that meant to flesh out his motives, along with disjointed book releases, but for many, combined with the fact that it sucked and their slow delivery, it did little to help. No one was happy to wait months for a snippet of information about why this bald idiot was now on a hierarchy above the Lich King and Sargeras. His final defeat felt anticlimactic, and he had a monologue that everybody mocked. The Helm of Domination turned into the crown from Burger King, and it was a laughable end to a laughable expansion, and lore channels had to have welfare checks.
How many books are you gonna fucking get out of me? How much money am I gonna pay before I can finally explain the lore to the people that want to know about it to the degree that it's actually comprehensible?
I will never serve.
In particular, Nobble, the king of Warcraft lore and also one of the nicest and most patient people on YouTube, had to take a break and go play Final Fantasy XIV during the Shadowlands expansion. Another issue with the raids was the rate at which they were delivered. Certainly due to the impact of COVID, Shadowlands suffered from substantial droughts in between major updates, so much so that there is even evidence that, similar to Draenor, an entire raid tier had to be cut from the expansion. There was evidence of an entrance in the Ardenweald zone, as well as scrapped data mined weapons labeled as Ardenweald Raid. Similar to the Warlords of Draenor, there ended up being just 3 major raids in the expansion, and the reason for this is up to debate. Some say it's because of COVID's negative impact on production, others believe it to be the overall poor reception of Shadowlands, and the rest believe the reason is because of what was about to be the biggest scandal in the developer's long history. At this point, Blizzard wasn't a stranger to scandals, but during Shadowlands, it was revealed that the California Department of Fair Employment and Housing had filed a lawsuit for alleged consistent sexual misconduct and discrimination in their workplace. The lawsuit alleged that employees of Blizzard would get drunk at work and perform what were called cube crawls, where they would stroll around the office making inappropriate sexual remarks and advances towards female employees. The news of this lawsuit opened the floodgates, and employees both past and current came out with personal accounts ranging from sexual discrimination to harassment to breast milk mysteriously disappearing from break room refrigerators. This would quickly become a historic scandal, which forced Bobby Kotick, who is not a lizard, to make a statement addressing it.
I want to talk with you today about our future and reiterate my conviction to create the most welcoming and inclusive workplace. Over the last few months, so many of you have generously and candidly shared your experiences and your insights about the type of company you want us to be. We've taken meaningful actions to improve our company and our culture, but there's more to do. To become the model workplace we all aspire to be, more change is required, but I am so confident we will get there. There will, of course, be continued media attention about us and our industry over the next few months. In fact, there's an article today that paints an inaccurate and misleading view of our company, of me personally, and my leadership. I want to say 2 important things about this. First, we are incredibly fortunate to have the most talented people in our industry, all so committed to constant improvement, and I share this commitment. The second thing I want to say is that anyone who doubts my conviction to be the most welcoming and inclusive workplace doesn't really appreciate how important this is to me. Creativity and inspiration thrives best in a safe, welcoming, respectful environment. There is no substitute for that. And staying true to our values without exceptions is the best way to retain our talent and to attract the new talent we need to achieve our great potential. As I've made clear, we're moving forward with a new zero-tolerance policy for inappropriate behavior, and zero means zero. Any reprehensible conduct is simply unacceptable. We have a chance to further enhance our culture and be the example other companies will follow. And we are so incredibly fortunate. Connecting and engaging the world through joy and fun is a powerful mission. Accomplishing this in a welcoming, inclusive workplace ensures we will achieve our mission with excellence. Over the last few years, our industry has had an uncomfortable spotlight that's been illuminating opportunities for us to change. And we must all, including me, embrace this need for change so we can bring our very best selves to the very best place to work. Thank you for your commitment to a culture of respect, your appreciation for the unique talents we each possess, and for maintaining the very best environment for all of us to work. For that, I am truly grateful.
The lawsuit would be settled in 2023, but it would rock the Blizzard community and permanently damage their reputation. Employees would begin protesting at Blizzard headquarters, and during this, a developer came out on Twitter and remarked that almost no work was being done while all of this was going on, which wasn't received too well as updates were already releasing at a sluggish pace. The forums were quickly filled by players demanding refunds in subscriptions, as they were now paying for a game that wasn't being developed, and in response, developers would publicly scold the players and branding them as immoral for lashing out. And to get their priorities straight, to show how much they respected women, they started changing pictures of them into fruit and censoring fart jokes. All in all, it was one of the biggest clusterfucks in gaming history, and it was one of the catalysts that transformed Blizzard into this punching bag that it is today. Leading up to Shadowlands, people were already pessimistic and they lamented that they had fallen from grace, so this widely publicized scandal only reaffirmed their beliefs, as fans were stunned watching how over the course of nearly 2 decades, the developer had transformed from the most beloved to everything they once stood against. Most, if not all, of the big names had jumped ship at this point, pursuing personal interests, with co-founder Mike Morhaime launching a new development team, Dreamhaven, which mission statement not so subtly hinted at the issues that had been plaguing Blizzard for years. So both inside and outside of the game, Shadowlands was perhaps the darkest period in not only World of Warcraft's history, but Blizzard's history as a whole, and even the most hardcore dedicated fans of the series who would defend anything and everything with it will agree with that. You had developers who were openly arguing with fans on Twitter for not liking features, morally shaming them for their own inability to not show up drunk to work, and most every major feature of the expansion falling flat on its face. Years later now, the developers have since then apologized for how badly it turned out, for the features themselves failing, as well as retconning decades of lore with a Thanos clone, and for the general clusterfuck that was the Shadowlands expansion. But there is a light at the end of the tunnel, as they had most certainly reached the bottom, and from here, the only direction to go was up. I'll see you in the next episode, where we'll take flight with Dragonflight.
Farewell for now, mortals. Hope you enjoyed today's video. See you again soon.